This week we're talking about the Gilded Age, so pay no attention to the fact that these slides look different from the ones that I have been using. This is some information I have previously used and just wanted to use it here again. So when we say that something is gilded, what we're really saying is that it's covered in gold. It has this golden or gold-like covering. So the Gilded Age then looks good, it looks shiny, it looks great on the surface. So when we talk about the Gilded Age, that's what we're saying. We're saying that this time period from the 1870s to 1900 looked good on the surface. Mark Twain gave it this name for that reason. Things looked great on the outside, but there was corruption on the inside. Politics during the Gilded Age was almost like recreation. It was entertainment. It was what people did to socialize. Politicians were colorful people, and the events where they spoke were also very vibrant, very colorful, very lively. A lot of times, this is where we see political rallies really start to develop, where people go to these things as a source of entertainment. And people felt like they supported a moral stance by taking a political stance. So that encouraged people not just to go for the fact that they were being entertained and it was something sociable to do, but it was also a way that they could support a good cause. And the best men, notice that that's in quotes, these are considered the young, dedicated experts of their era, analyzed politics and their impact. So people are starting to look at the impact of politics on people, which is very progressive. So during this Gilded Age, the two major parties, as you might have guessed, were the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republican Party, or GOP, GOP is an abbreviation for Grand Ole Party. This was the party of big business. These post-war tycoons financed the Republican Party. The Democratic Party was a minor party. It was still negatively associated with the Civil War, and the people who were pro-secession, that sort of thing, pro-Confederacy. So the Democratic Party was still very negatively associated with the Civil War, and it seemed to appeal more to rural people and urban voters who opposed industrialism. So there again, Republicans, the post-war party financed by tycoons, the party of big business. The Democrats were a minor party. Then, and possibly as now, people voted for the party that represented their economic interest. Now notice the slides say men voted for the party that best represented their economic interest, and that's very accurate. Women are still not voting at this time. So as men are voting for the party that best represents their interest, they look at the Republicans, which at that time represented progress, people who were rich and successful, and the Democrats represented rural, unprogressive, poor, unsuccessful people. So neither party really dominated national politics for a while, and all federal elections were close. It was more about the individual person running and the draw that they could get from voters. And just as an example of a couple of these close federal elections, in 1890, Garfield, the Republican who won the election, was up against the Democrat Hancock, and Garfield won by only 7,000 votes. Now, in the grand scheme of things, 7,000 sounds like a lot. If someone were going to give us $7,000 and just drop it in our lap, that'd be a lot. That'd be a windfall. However, 7,000 votes in the grand scheme of the population, the voting population of the United States, was not very much. And then just 4 years later, 1894, Cleveland versus Blaine, Cleveland, the Democrat, won that by less than 25,000 votes out of 10 million that were cast. So you can see 25,000 is not a big chunk when you're talking about 10 million votes. At this time, corruption was in every level of politics, whether it was city, state, nation. it was there, largely because of something known as the spoils system. And this is where politicians appointed friends and relatives to federal jobs, because the federal jobs are the great jobs. So if you hold a high enough office, then you could appoint people to hold those jobs, those cushy jobs. Now, these cushy jobs were not just for men. Men and women both looked for federal jobs, and they worked hard for candidates to get them elected, and then they expected these appointments in return. So while it sounds, some of this still goes on today. Let's just be honest. If you work hard for a candidate, they find a position for you. And maybe that doesn't just stop with politics. But anyway, this, as you can imagine, was not an effective system for taxpayers because it cost a lot of money. So every 4 years, if you have new people getting elected, and every 4 years you have them appointing their friends, then you don't have people who learn the job, stay with the job, and continue doing well with the job because they're constantly being reappointed. You're constantly training new people. Training people is expensive, and so it just was not a cost-effective system. The Civil War legacy also played a role in determining who a person might choose to affiliate with as far as a political party. Republicans tended to appeal to these Union veterans and to people from the North. Democrats appealed to Southern voters who had opposed emancipation. Also, factors like race, religion, and nationality also played a role in which party people supported. German, Irish, and Scandinavian immigrants from 1830 to 1870 really emerged as a strong political force during that time period. The Democrats emphasized right belief over personal regeneration. Catholics wanted freedom to choose schools, like parochial schools, instead of just public schools, and they wanted a portion of tax money to pay for those church schools. So there are also some other things that people were taking into consideration this time as they're deciding between the Democrat and Republican Party. One of these things were blue laws. Blue laws prohibited businesses from being open on Sundays. People were not allowed to work. They banned recreation on the Sabbath day, which was celebrated as Sunday. So in my lifetime, I remember blue laws and not being able to, go shop and buy toys on Sunday. You could buy medication if you were sick. You could go buy Tylenol or something like that, but you could not stop and shop for certain things if it was on a Sunday. And only some stores were open on Sundays, like a drugstore, something like that. Baptists, Presbyterians, and Methodists wanted looser blue laws. So they didn't want it to be so strict. They wanted that to loosen up a little bit. But the Catholics, Jews, Lutherans, and Episcopalians wanted to keep this ritual of the Sabbath and to keep businesses restricted on the Sabbath day. The American Protective Association came about during this time. It was an anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant organization that said that Catholics were not true Americans. And this organization, the American Protective Association, aligned with the Democratic Party. So now, not only does the Democratic Party have the negativity still associated with it from the pre-Civil War time, but now they also have this negativity associated with it as they take a stance against Catholics and immigrants. Now, we've talked about the two main political parties during this era, the Democrat Party, the Republican Party. We also have another one starting to develop called the Populist Party. Starting in 1892, the People's Party came about, the People's Party of USA, or the Populist Party. It was launched by the Farmers Alliance, and the idea that they had was they wanted to make government more accountable. So the party platform was to develop free unlimited coinage of silver at a 16-to-1 ratio with gold. They also wanted a graduated income tax, so people who make less money pay less, people who make more money then would pay a little more. They wanted postal savings banks for small savers, so they wanted to encourage saving. And there was a time period when people really did focus on saving. And this is kind of just setting the stage for that. They also called for secret ballot voting. They wanted immigration restrictions, and they wanted an 8-hour federal workday. So in 1892, that was not a guarantee yet. So they really wanted to push that 8-hour workday. So in order to gain popularity for this new party, the Populist Party, everyone was encouraged to vote, and Tom Watson of Georgia encouraged black voters to vote for the Populist Party to encourage that populist vote for fair treatment, that their platform would be better for black Americans. North Carolina blacks had a visible role in the 1892 campaign. Ironically, though, this is Georgia, where Tom Watson is from, and he's proposing this. Southern populists still sought to keep blacks in their place. Notice the quotes in that. So the Southern aspect of this, whether, Democratic Party or Populist Party, the Southerners were still trying to maintain this idea of white supremacy even post-Civil War. And in the election of 1896, William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska faced off with McKinley. McKinley won, Bryan lost. The important thing to remember here is that Bryan also favored the standard of currency being silver instead of gold. And this is an editorial cartoon featuring William Jennings Bryan here as he's running for office. And although they criticized Bryan's religious rhetoric, the Republicans had their own slogan, which was "In God We Trust, in Bryan We Bust." So they used that as a campaign slogan against Bryan. The election's religious flavor is ironic because the real issues of 1896 were economic, not religious at all. And this map of the 1896 election shows in the area down at the bottom, you can see the popular vote for each of the candidates. But on each state, you can see the total electoral college vote too. And you can see that Arkansas's electoral college votes went for Bryan in 1896. Also in this time period, the Gilded Age, literature is starting to change. So now literature begins to tie to regional culture. Mark Twain was one of the famous authors of this time period, and these writers were more realistic than romantic. In terms of painting and architecture, the Henri Group was 8 artists who worked to establish an American art form and style that was separate from European. They some used reality in their unidealized views of the cities. Others incorporated this reality with colors that the French artists use. So they're using French artist colors in American landscapes. It's kind of a neat combination of the cultures. Also culturally, people have leisure time and they're finding new ways to spend it. Like we've talked about in the last chapter, one of these ways was through baseball, because baseball was something inexpensive that people of the working middle class or even the working poor could do, because baseball was so inexpensive. Prize fighting was also very entertaining and well attended at this time. Another thing that came about were motion pictures. So at this point we're talking silent motion pictures. We're not making talkies yet, but silent motion pictures where there would be text that would kind of move the story along, and not exactly to the point of closed captioning where you had, he said, she said during the dialogue, but just a little like a slideshow presentation is today, where one slide moves the progress along. Then they would often have music playing, live music playing to accompany the pictures. One of these movie theaters was in Malvern, and it was actually an outdoor theater where people would go. There was a large screen, the movie was shown on it, and there was a local pianist who would sit there and play, and of course she would adjust the music according to the mood of the movie that was being shown. So that was pretty neat. Downtown, where Main Street is now, there used to be an outdoor theater there. Also vaudeville, which is sort of like a variety show, big time variety show. So vaudeville acts were a big deal. A lot of these, you didn't have to go somewhere big to see vaudeville acts. Like they would tour, and people would get to see vaudeville shows in their own town, or vaudeville style shows in their own town. Also, culturally, education is growing in importance. At this time, 80% of American youth were actually attending school. Most states required school attendance through the 8th grade. And then there were also higher education opportunities developing during this time period for women. Another important development, or continuing development through the Gilded Age, is journalism. There were not any photos being used yet. Newspapers still relied on an artist drawing for images, if any images were used at all. Most of the time, newspapers were just type. And we see yellow journalism develop during the Gilded Age. Yellow journalism emphasizes human interest stories, including crime, corruption, disasters, sudden luck, and oddities. Anything to sensationalize. They would use racy headlines and use sales schemes and promotions to get more subscribers. So this sensationalism is basically what we're referring to when we say yellow journalism. The goal of these newspapers simply was to outsell the other papers, to win the competition, to sell more, to make more money. Joseph Pulitzer was one of these publishers. He had the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the New York World, and he was the creator of yellow journalism because it was named for the first ever comic strip that he published called The Yellow Kid, and part of it was printed in yellow ink, like the t-shirt that one of these kids would wear was published or was printed in yellow ink. William Randolph Hearst had the New York Journal, and he started a comic called the Katzenjammer Kids, also a secondary cartoon called the Happy Hooligans, and then on top of that, he stole the Yellow Kid from Pulitzer. This was a very competitive time for newspaper in the Gilded Age. We see some other changes culturally too. Darwin's ideas, the idea of survival of the fittest, are seen as progressive and basically promotes the idea that all things change over time, which is important to what Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. says. He was a Supreme Court Associate Justice, and he attacked the idea that laws are unchanging. He said that all laws have to evolve to serve the needs of the people that they govern. So as a culture expands and has new needs, new laws must be developed or altered to fit those current needs. And then Lester Ward was a reform Darwinist who believed evolution implies cooperation as well as competition. So it's not just about survival of the fittest, it's about working to figure out what the fittest is and maybe combining resources in order to do better and to thrive.